Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Texas Podcast. My name is Gabe, and I will be your host for today. We will be picking up on where we left off in the last video, which would be the Siege of the Alamo. This will be days 3 through 5. The Mexican bombardment continued through the morning of February 25th. At approximately 10 a.m., about 200 to 300 Mexican soldiers, primarily cazadores from the Matamoros Battalion, crossed the San Antonio River, and they took cover in abandoned shacks approximately 90 yards to 100 yards from the Alamo walls. The Mexican soldiers were intending to use the huts as cover to erect another artillery battery, although many Texans assumed they were actually launching an assault on the fort. Travis called for volunteers to burn the huts, despite the fact that it was broad daylight and they would be within musket range of the Mexican soldiers. Charles Despalier, Robert Brown, and James Rose, and a few others volunteered for the mission. To provide cover, Dickinson and his men fired their 8-pound cannon filled with grape shot and canister at the Mexican soldiers in the huts. Crockett and his men fired rifles, while other Texans reloaded extra weapons for them. Within 2 hours, the battle was over. As soon as the Texans saw flames erupting from the huts, they threw open the Alamo gate and the Texans re-entered the Alamo unscathed. Although Rose was almost captured by a Mexican officer, the Mexican soldiers retreated after 6 or 7 of their soldiers were killed, and 4 of them were wounded, while several Texans had been mildly scratched by flying rocks. That afternoon, Mexican soldiers were posted east of the Alamo, on the road to Gonzales. Santa Anna learned that a beautiful 17-year-old girl, Melchora Barrera, and her widowed mother had remained in town, and he dispatched one of his men to ask the girl to be Santa Anna's mistress. According to historian J.R. Edmondson, the girl's mother refused the offer, and although Santa Anna was already married, one of his officers dressed up as a priest and performed a marriage ceremony. Santa Anna then retired to enjoy a honeymoon. Santa Anna sent a messenger to tell Gaona to hurry to Behar with his 3 best companies. At the time, the 1st Brigade was at San Antonio, a day's march north of the Rio Grande, according to the diary of Jose Enrique de la Peña. On this day, carelessness led the Aldama Battalion powder supply to catch fire, causing considerable alarm. Travis also wrote another letter requesting help. The Texan officers voted that Seguin should carry the message. Travis was adamant that Seguin remain behind, as his knowledge of the language, the countryside, and the Mexican customs was invaluable. Texans believed that none of the other couriers had made it through the Mexican lines, and told Travis that Seguin's knowledge of Spanish would also help him to avoid capture by Mexican patrols. Seguin, riding Bowie's horse, which was the fastest in the mission, and his aide Antonio Cruz left about 9 p.m. Seguin did not expect to survive the mission. He and Cruz encountered a Mexican cavalry patrol, but were able to escape using their knowledge of Spanish and the local terrain. After dark, a small party of Texans left the Alamo to burn down more of the huts. All were able to return to the Alamo without injury. Despite their efforts, several huts remained standing, and overnight the Mexican army was able to erect a battery only 300 yards from the Alamo. An additional battery was erected at the location known as the Old Powerhouse, 1,000 yards to the southeast of the Alamo. The Mexican army now had artillery stationed on 3 sides of the Alamo. Historian Walter Lord said that in the evening several Mexicans left the Alamo and asked to surrender to Santa Anna. They were told that Santa Anna had retired for the evening and could not be disturbed. February 26th through the 27th. Residents of Behar were able to come into or near the Alamo in the first few days of the siege. Seguin's meals had been delivered to a local, Estaban Pacheco. During the first weeks of the siege, over 200 Mexican cannon shots landed in the Alamo Plaza. The Texans often picked up the cannonballs and reused them. Although the Texans had matched Mexican artillery fire on February 26, Travis ordered the artillery to stop firing to conserve powder and shot. Crockett and his men were encouraged to keep shooting, as they rarely missed and thus didn't waste a shot. Through the early days of the siege, the Texans didn't bother to take cover, as the Mexicans were too far out of range to cause harm with their muskets. Any Mexican soldier who ventured within 200 yards of the Alamo, however, risked death or injury. A blue northern wind blew in that evening and dropped the temperatures to 39 degrees freezing. Neither army was prepared for the cold temperatures. Several Texans ventured out to gather firewood, but returned empty-handed after encountering Mexican skirmishers. The evening of February 26th, the Texans burned more huts, these located near the San Luis Potosi Battalion. Santa Anna sent Colonel Juan Bringas to engage the Texans, and according to Edmondson, 1 Texan was killed. On February 26, news of the siege finally reached acting Governor James W. Robinson, who immediately sent a courier to find Sam Houston. Travis's messengers were having small success. Albert Martin had reached Gonzales, the most westerly community of Texans. On February 25th, the day after Sutherland Smith had arrived with Travis's first message, as couriers delivered the messages to other settlements, reinforcements began to assemble in Gonzales, waiting for Fannin to arrive with more troops so they could travel together. In Gonzales itself, Robert Three-Legged Willie Williamson began a recruitment drive, and Bastrop Edward Burleson began organizing a militia, which likely left for Gonzales on February 27th, arriving the following day. Unbeknownst to the Texans, Colonel James Fannin had finally decided to ride to their relief. Historian Robert Scott suggests that the trip was initiated after Fannin's objections were overridden by his officers. On the morning of February 26, he set out with 320 men, 4 cannon, and several supply wagons for the 90 miles march from Goliad to the Alamo. The Goliad garrison had no horses to move the wagons and artillery and were forced to rely on oxen. Barely 200 yards into their journey, one of their wagons broke down. The expedition stopped for repairs. The group then took 6 hours to cross the waist-deep water of the San Antonio River. By the time they reached the other side, it was dark, and the men camped along the river. The cold front reached Goliad that evening, and the poorly dressed soldiers were quickly chilled and miserable in the driving rain. On awakening, Fannin realized that all of the Texan oxen had wandered off, and that his men had neglected to pack food for the journey. It took most of the day for the men to round up the oxen. After 2 days of travel, Fannin's men had not even ventured 1 mile from their fort. In a letter to acting Governor James Robinson, Fannin said that his officers approached him to ask that the rescue trip be canceled, as they had received word that General Urrea's army was marching towards Goliad. The officers and men in the expedition claimed that Fannin decided to abort the mission. Several of the men agreed that the decision, with Dr. Bernard writing in his journal, with but 3 of 400 men, mostly on foot, with but a limited supply of provision, and march a distance of nearly 100 miles through uninhabited country for the purpose of relieving a fortress beleaguered by 5,000 men, was madness. Before initially leaving for Goliad, Fannin sent a courier to Gonzales to instruct Williamson to rendezvous at Cibolo Creek, halfway through Gonzales and San Antonio, just north of present-day La Verde. On February 28th, about 60 men, including Captain Albert Martin, traveled the 20 miles from Gonzales to Cibolo Creek to wait for Fannin and his men. Lindley speculates that Fannin sent an advance relief force under Captain John Chenoweth and Francis de Sac to scout the area around Bayard. The advance force reached as far as the Seguin Ranch, gathering corn, cattle, horses, and mules. Then they turned back to wait along Cibolo Creek for the remainder of Fannin's force. Several residents had seen Fannin march from Goliad and sent messengers to Bayard to inform Santa Anna that Fannin and 300 men were headed for the Alamo. Santa Anna ordered Colonel Juan Almonte to receive 800 dragoons and intercept the Texan relief force. Unaware of Fannin's attempted relief mission, Travis sent James Bonham to Goliad to pursue him. Bonham was asked to tie a white handkerchief around his hat when he returned so that the Texans would know to open the gates for him. Much of the Mexican army's provisions were in the rear of the convoy with Gaona Filisola. Santa Anna had hoped to restock his army supplies in Bayard, but were unable to find much. He finally asked the local citizen Manuel Menchaca to help them find food. Menchaca led the army to the Seguin and Flores ranches and stole all of their corn, beef, and hogs. Santa Anna sent more couriers to Gaona and Filisola to urge them to hurry. Filisola was still at the Rio Grande. During the day, the Mexican army tried to block an irrigation ditch into the Alamo. Texan Green Jameson tasked the men in the Alamo with finishing a well at the south end of the plaza. Although the men hit water, they weakened an earth and timber parapet by the low barracks. The mound collapsed, leaving no way to fire safely over that wall. The same day, Texans spotted a Mexican general surrounded by aides and dragoons and fired, but did not hit any of them. The Texans did not realize that it was Santa Anna. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.